Good morning, friends. Now, we're going to take a bit of a left turn today because we're going to look at Sunday's text from Matthew 26, not for what it explicitly says, but for what some might try to make it say. Because certainly in the secular unbelieving world, but even in that wider umbrella, often significantly more liberal so-called Christian world, people look for ways to make the scripture say what they want it to say, rather than what it actually does say. One instance of this is in the case of abortion. Now, I know that abortion has been categorized by many people as being a political matter, therefore pastors shouldn't talk about it. But the truth is that abortion is not primarily a political matter. It is a moral matter, and God has much to say about it. Because God is the God of life, and He is the God of justice, which is why the sixth of the 10 commandments says, "Ye shall not murder." And murder should rightly be understood as the unjust taking of human life. Because according to God's own standards, there are justified ways of taking human life. There are times, now hear me say that, there are times, not every time, but there are times when war is justified. Therefore, killing the enemy in that kind of a war is not murder. There are times that, as a result of due jurisprudence, the guilty party is subject to capital punishment and therefore put to death. So these are cases of justified killing, justified even in the eyes of God, according to the principles that He has given us in His Word, and therefore those occasions are not murder, they are not sinful, they confer no guilt whatsoever on the soldier or on the executioner, as the case may be. But taking a human life at whatever stage of life in an unjust manner absolutely is sinful and should be considered a violation of that sixth commandment. Therefore, the biblical position would be that abortion is the unjust taking of human life, therefore it is murder. The child, in earthly terms, is innocent and therefore not deserving of being put to death by any earthly authority. And it really is as simple as that. A baby in the womb is a human being. From the moment of conception, they are a human being, created in the image of God, being formed by God in those inward parts, and they have all the dignity and value of humanity as created by God. And even in certain circumstances of, I hate to even use the words, but rape and incest and such like that, it's not the baby's fault. They are not the criminal. And therefore they are not guilty. They should not be punished. They are innocent. Therefore, considering their status as human beings created in the image of God, along with that earthly innocence, having committed no crime that would justify their termination by any earthly authority, then if their life is taken, it is taken in an unjust manner, and therefore that is murder. And this is why people try to find a justification for abortion, for the taking of that baby's life. Because obviously, if it's unjust, therefore it's murder. Well, then if you can justify it, if you can put it in that classification of justified taking of human life, then it is no longer murder. It is no longer sinful. It no longer confers guilt on those who do it. And one of the attempts to justify abortion is when people claim that it would be irresponsible to bring the child into the world, as they put it, because all that child will experience will be pain and hardship. The idea being that a child born to just, let's say, as an example, a very young single mother who has no prospects for giving that child a life that consists of anything other than being stuck in poverty and suffering in any number of different ways, well, then it is actually better for the child, or so the justification goes, it is actually better for the child to not be born at all. After all, isn't it better to not be born than to live a life of constant suffering? And here's the thing. It would seem that Sunday's text would give some legitimacy to that line of reasoning. After all, doesn't Jesus say that it would be better for his betrayer to have never been born than to suffer the punishment that results from that betrayal? And therefore, there seems to be a situation where knowing that someone will suffer means that it would have been better for them to never have been born. And the parallel is not hard to see at all between that and the baby that will presumably be better off not being born, so being aborted, having that pregnancy terminated before they're born, when they will experience nothing but hardship in this life. But there are two reasons this line of thinking remains illegitimate. First, Jesus is the one who has absolute knowledge, and therefore he can with certainty say what is in store for the person who betrays him. But none of us has that same perfect knowledge. We simply cannot know that a child, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, will only ever experience suffering. I recently heard a very successful and well-respected preacher by the name of Voddie Baucham share from his own voice the fact that he was born to a 16-year-old single mother in the inner city of LA. And that would be a prime example of a situation where people would say that that pregnancy should be terminated because that child is doomed to live a life of suffering. But Voddie is now a famous preacher who was able to not only go to college, but receive a doctorate. He has helped to start a university in Africa. He's written several books, and probably most important of all, and I think that he would say this as well, he is in a loving marriage with a wonderful wife, and they've been faithful to each other for however many years, and they have something like 9 kids of their own. So even taking eternal matters out of the equation for a moment, this is a man living life to the fullest, despite the circumstances of his birth and the difficulties of his upbringing. And there are so many examples of people living full, productive, and happy lives despite being born in very difficult circumstances. So the logic does not work because no one can truly know what a child's life will be like. The other reason that line of thinking does not work is because of the language of the scriptures themselves, even this very text. Because it is true that, at least as we read in our English translations, Jesus says it would be better if he had never been born. But there's something about that we need to recognize. The Greek word that has been translated as born can also just as easily be translated as conceived. And so the translators could have equally quoted Jesus as having said, it would be better if he had never been conceived. Because while God absolutely does have all knowledge, the people of the culture of that day didn't. And while they understood the idea of conception, they didn't know all of the developmental processes that took place in the womb as we do today. And therefore, the ideas of conception and birth were linked very closely together. And in some senses, the same word meaning both, they were kind of interchangeable. And on top of that, there are many different ways of speaking. One such way is speaking in a sort of colloquial way where we express something and everyone knows what we mean, but what we say does not actually represent reality. For instance, we might ask what time the sun comes up in the morning, or, hey, what time does the sun set in the evening? And we all know what we're talking about, despite the fact that in reality, the sun does not come up and the sun does not set. Rather, the earth rotates on its axis, which gives the perception of the sun coming up and setting. And we all know the scientific fact, but it doesn't stop us from using the colloquial language of talking about the sun coming up and going down. In the same way, we are all familiar with the colloquial saying, better to have never been born, when what we really mean is better to have never existed. But the idea of never existing needs to be linked to conception, not to physical, actual birth, okay? Because just like the sun doesn't actually come up and set, a human life doesn't actually start at birth. Birth is not the dividing point between existence and non-existence. That's just the colloquial way we talk about things. The truth is, and it is reflected in the original Greek of this text, as I've already mentioned, the truth is that a human life begins at conception. And again, Jesus could just as easily be quoted as saying, would have been better for him never to be conceived, because that works. That would be the technical way of saying better to have never existed at all. Because as soon as a child is conceived in the womb, they exist. They are, in fact, a human baby endowed with all the dignity and value of being created in the image of God. And so we can't go to this passage and say, let me say that again, we cannot go to this passage and say, see, Jesus says it's better for Judas to have never been born than to experience the suffering that he's gonna. And that's all we're saying about these unwanted pregnancies. It's better for them to not be born than to experience a life of suffering. But again, that does not work because, number one, we don't know that the child will experience a life of suffering, even if you just keep the argument at that level. And number two, what Jesus said is actually no different from saying it's better for him never to have been conceived. That is the technical reality that underlies the non-technical colloquial saying, because existence starts at conception, not at birth. So once a child has been conceived, again, they exist. And if you terminate their life in the womb, then that is the unjust taking of human life, and that ought not be done. Now, I love you guys, and I know this is a difficult topic, but the Lord has called us to declare the truth no matter how difficult it may be. Also, please know, before I close, this does not mean that I believe that any Christian should be eager to condemn those who have had abortions. There has been much deception regarding this issue. There have been people who have been duped and who've been told by the people they're supposed to trust, doctors and oftentimes their own parents or whoever, and they've been convinced that an abortion is not what it actually is. Therefore, I'm not saying that we should be eager to fill our prisons with 16-year-old girls who have had abortions. We are allowed to be gracious and merciful toward them, even as the Lord has been merciful and gracious toward us concerning our own sins. The most important thing is to spread the truth, not simply in a legal way, but in a cultural way, so that there would be fewer and fewer people who want abortions because they understand what sex and marriage and reproduction is all about. We can forgive. We can be merciful. In my mind, helping people to have a change of heart and mind, to embrace the truth and spread the word of that truth, that is much more important than simply being eager to punish people for what they did previously. So again, I love you. I pray you have a good and godly day. And Lord willing, I'll see you soon.